Hello everyone, welcome to a 1-hour collection of disturbing horror stories. These 11 true tales will take you into the chilling atmosphere of the night, perfect for sleeping. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and enjoy the spine-tingling journey. If you enjoy, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with friends for an extra dose of fright. Let's get started. I've always loved camping, especially venturing into remote places to experience the tranquility and mystery of nature. Every summer, my friends and I would choose a forest far from the city to set up camp. This year, we decided on a secluded forest that was said to be both grand and tranquil, a perfect place for adventurers like us. We brought tents, sleeping bags, and food, trekking through dense woods until we finally reached our chosen campsite at sunset. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. The sun slowly descended, casting a golden glow on the leaves, and the area felt serene yet mysterious. I looked around, feeling a strange sense of unease, but I couldn't pinpoint the reason. As the sky darkened completely, we built a campfire and sat around it, enjoying a rare moment of peace away from modern life. The firelight flickered on our faces, casting shadows on the ground. The surrounding trees were bathed in light and shadow, almost as if they were silently watching us. Gradually, our conversation turned to urban legends. One friend shared a tale of a ghostly figure that supposedly haunted the deep woods, a hunter who had gone missing while searching for his lost family. Another friend laughed it off, saying it was nonsense and that the forest was likely filled only with wild animals. However, none of us noticed that as we joked and talked, there seemed to be a pair of unseen eyes watching us from the shadows beyond the fire's reach. As the night grew deeper, everyone gradually retreated to their tents. I crawled into my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and listened to the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze, feeling the quiet exhaustion lulling me to sleep. Just as I was about to drift off, a faint sound of footsteps came from nearby. At first, I thought it was the wind stirring the branches, but the footsteps became more rhythmic and heavy, not a natural sound at all. I opened my eyes and listened intently. The footsteps seemed to be drawing closer, as if something was making its way toward our camp. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, my heartbeat quickening as I dared not make a sound. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and a strange tension filled the air. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a night-dwelling animal, maybe a deer passing by. However, what happened next shattered any sense of comfort. As I tried to calm myself, a low, heavy breathing sound came from just outside my tent. The sound was rough and slow, like someone taking deep breaths in the darkness. My eyes widened, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. The breathing continued intermittently, sounding like some massive creature lingering outside my tent. I wanted to wake my friends, but it felt as if my voice was stuck, unable to escape my throat. My hands clenched my sleeping bag tightly as sweat trickled down my forehead. I could feel my breathing quickening, and it seemed like the presence outside sensed my fear. After a while, the breathing slowly ceased, and the footsteps resumed, this time even closer. I held my breath, eyes shut tight, body rigid as I feared the thing outside might suddenly open my tent. Suddenly, I heard a soft scraping sound against the tent fabric, as if the thing was gently brushing against it. Helpless and terrified, my mind conjured horrifying images. What kind of creature was it? Why was it here? What was it looking for? Time seemed to stretch painfully in the dark. The footsteps outside continued intermittently, as if the presence was still wandering around our camp. I silently prayed for it to leave, to move away from my tent. But just as I began to relax, I heard a low, distant whisper, a weak, indistinct voice as if calling from far away. I wanted to open my eyes, but my body was paralyzed with fear. Then, suddenly, something struck my tent hard. The noise nearly stopped my heart. I covered my mouth, trying desperately not to make any sound. Just as I was on the verge of breaking down, the footsteps finally began to recede, as if the thing had finally given up and vanished into the darkness. I lay still for a while, ensuring the silence around me before daring to open my eyes. In the darkness, my heart continued pounding uncontrollably, and my back was soaked with sweat. I stayed awake all night, silently waiting for dawn. As morning sunlight filtered through the trees into the campsite, its warmth brought a slight sense of relief. My friends emerged from their tents, each with a calm expression, as though nothing unusual had happened overnight. I decided to keep silent, choosing to bury the terrifying experience deep within. But when I started to pack up my tent, I noticed a strange set of footprints on the ground. These prints circled around our campsite, unevenly spaced and leading off into the distance, as though the thing from last night had been real. I stood by the prints, a chill running through me. The shapes didn't look like human footprints, they seemed more like those of some wild beast, yet there was something unsettlingly precise about them. My friends noticed my uneasy expression and gathered around, asking if something was wrong. I hesitated briefly before deciding not to tell them about last night. Perhaps it had just been my imagination, a nightmare fueled by the dark. However, every time I recall the footsteps, the low whispering, and that shadowy figure, a cold shiver runs through me. That night remains etched in my memory, an enigma I could never shake off. Since then, I have never returned to that forest, hoping that mysterious thing will never appear in my life again. That morning, the air was slightly damp. My friends and I packed up our gear, preparing to camp in a forest few had ventured into. The weather forecast predicted fog that night, but we didn't mind. In fact, we thought it would add a touch of mystery. As we drove away from the city, the scenery gradually became desolate, and the green hues of the forest unfolded before us. After several hours of driving, we finally reached the forest entrance. From here, only a narrow path led into the dense woods, winding and twisting as if it were taking us into another world. We shouldered our backpacks and walked along the trail for about an hour until we found a spacious campsite with a good view. It was surrounded by tall pine trees, with the ground covered in thick pine needles that felt soft underfoot. The silence was such that we could only hear our own breathing. After setting up our tents, the sky had begun to darken, and the last glimmers of sunset cast a warm glow on the treetops, as shadows slowly took over. We lit a campfire, sat around it, and began to relax and enjoy ourselves. But as night deepened, a thick fog began creeping out of the forest, slowly engulfing the campsite. The firelight flickered through the mist, making everything around us appear shrouded in a hazy veil. As we marveled at the mysterious beauty of the fog, a faint whisper came from a distance. The sound was intermittent and ethereal, as though the depths of the forest were quietly murmuring secrets. We exchanged uneasy glances. The previously light-hearted atmosphere was replaced by an indescribable heaviness. Although I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, a strange chill crept into my heart. We sat around the fire, which was flickering weakly in the mist, making the campsite feel even more quiet and eerie. The whispers came and went, sometimes near, sometimes far, as though they were moving closer. Our laughter died down as we turned our heads toward the dark forest. The fog seemed thicker than we had anticipated, obscuring even the trees not far from our camp. As the night grew darker, an unsettling feeling began to take over. Initially, we tried to reassure ourselves, saying, "It's probably just the wind, or maybe some birds." One friend, attempting to lighten the mood, joked, "Or maybe a little critter snoring." We all forced a laugh, trying to dispel our unease. However, the whispers grew louder, like some kind of language, subtle but intense, making us feel an overwhelming urge to flee. Finally, one friend stood up, suggesting we investigate the source of the sound. But just as he rose, the whispers abruptly stopped, as though sensing our movement. A strange silence fell over the camp, broken only by the crackling of the fire. We looked at each other, hesitating to explore further. At that moment, a shadowy figure appeared briefly in the mist, darting through our line of sight. A shiver ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. The way the shadow moved was unnatural, almost as if it were gliding instead of walking. I tried to reassure myself that it was just an illusion, the fog and firelight playing tricks on us. But the unease grew stronger. Minutes passed in silence as we sat still, listening to the heavy quiet surrounding us. Suddenly, the sound of faint footsteps echoed through the fog, seeming to circle us but always just out of sight. The footsteps were slow and heavy, as if carrying a restrained intensity. "Maybe someone's lost?" a friend whispered nervously. We glanced at each other, finally mustering the courage to pull out a flashlight and shine it toward the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the dense mist but revealed nothing. We stared into the dark woods, unconsciously holding our breath. At that moment, the whispers resumed, this time with a low, rhythmic quality, like a distant call, as though summoning something. The sound was no longer faint and elusive but clearer, with certain eerie tones coming through. It felt as if the sound was drawing closer, and my heart began pounding, sensing an unseen presence approaching. One of my friends suddenly clutched my arm, terror in his eyes. His trembling hand pointed into the fog, his lips quivering as though he couldn't speak. I followed his gaze and saw, deep within the mist, a faint face forming, as if it had emerged from the fog itself. The face had no distinct features, only an outline, but it emanated a suffocating, oppressive presence, floating silently in the mist, as if observing us. Just as I was paralyzed by fear, the face began drifting toward us. Terror washed over us, and we all stood up, ready to flee. But footsteps echoed around us again, as if blocking every direction. The whispers grew louder, like an ancient chant, echoing in our ears. My mind blanked, and I could only follow my friends as we ran to the other side of the camp. The fog seemed to follow us, growing thicker and surrounding us completely. I felt the footsteps and whispers closing in, relentlessly pursuing us. Each time we quickened our pace, they seemed to match it, always right behind. We didn't know how long we had been running. Our energy was waning, our steps heavy. Yet the whispers showed no signs of stopping, as though determined to close in on us. Out of breath, I looked back and saw the vague face looming in the fog again, as if watching our every move. Just as we despaired, feeling there was no escape, the ground beneath us suddenly softened, like we had stepped into a marshy area. My feet sank into the mud, trapping me. My friends were also struggling in the muddy ground, trying to pull free but unable to escape. The whispers became sharper, as if mocking our helplessness. The fog thickened, enveloping us, and I felt my breathing grow labored, as if an invisible weight was pressing down on us. Then, the face in the fog drew closer, so near I could almost feel its gaze burning into my skin. I shut my eyes, bracing for the horror to come. Suddenly, a faint light appeared through the mist, shining on my face. I slowly opened my eyes to see the source of the light, a flashlight beam. I struggled to look toward the light's direction and realized it was our campfire, still burning gently, as if calling us back. I managed to free my foot from the mud and crawled toward the campfire. My friends also broke free from the muddy ground and stumbled toward the fire. As we neared the fire, the face faded into the mist, and the whispers gradually died down, as though dispersed by an unseen force. Finally, we reached the campfire and collapsed beside it, gasping for air, hearts still racing. I looked around at the fog, feeling a lingering fear without understanding what we had just encountered. We exchanged glances but didn't dare mention the experience, silently watching the fire, unwilling to face the terrifying darkness again. That night, we camped beside a mountain stream. The cool water flowed gently, bringing a fresh, damp breeze that made us feel at ease. The forest around us was quiet and deep, and the stars in the sky were so bright it felt like we could reach out and touch them. Despite only a few of us being there, the embrace of nature filled us with joy. As night fell, we lit a campfire and sat around it, chatting. Occasionally, the distant calls of night birds would echo, adding a bit of life to the quiet night. We kept talking, and soon our conversation shifted to eerie stories, sharing strange tales in an attempt to spook each other. Just then, a low, haunting song drifted from deep within the forest. The song was soft and elongated, carrying a distant and indescribable emotion. We paused our conversation and exchanged glances, trying to locate the source of the sound. The song floated on the night breeze, intermittent, as though some hidden presence was humming softly in the dark. My heart began to race, and my mind filled with strange possibilities. My friends started whispering, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Yet the song grew clearer, as though it was slowly moving closer from the depths of the forest. There was an eerie rhythm to it, unsettling, as if it were an ancient call. With each haunting note that reached us, the tension around the camp grew. At first, we laughed it off, joking that it could be the wind or some bird calls. But as time passed, the song not only persisted but became even clearer, as if someone were quietly singing an ancient melody in the shadowy forest. A creeping unease filled my heart. This song seemed to have an inexplicable pull, drawing me to investigate. I looked around and saw that my friends wore the same uneasy expressions. They had felt the same pressure. Someone suggested we return to our tents, but we all knew the song would still seep through the night air, making rest impossible. Finally, one friend couldn't resist. He picked up a flashlight and began walking in the direction of the sound. He turned and said, "It's probably just a wanderer or someone who got lost. Let's go check, maybe we can help." Despite his words, our expressions were wary. However, curiosity won out, and we decided to follow him. The flashlight beam cut through the night mist, illuminating a narrow path through the trees. We moved slowly, with only our footsteps breaking the silence, accompanied by the faint, haunting melody that seemed to lead us onward. As we walked, the song grew clearer, as if it were just ahead of us. Its rhythm was almost irresistible, guiding us deeper without us noticing the passage of time. A friend trembled and whispered, "We should leave. Something's not right here." But when we tried to move, it felt as if our feet were anchored to the ground, unable to take a step. An unseen force seemed to grip us, as though determined to keep us here. As we struggled to break free, a shadow began to form in the mist, slowly taking on a human-like shape. The figure stood by one of the stones, head lowered, appearing to gaze at something invisible to us. It had no face, just a vague outline, yet its presence was suffocating. The shadow stood in the mist, softly singing that same haunting song, its voice ethereal and otherworldly. We were transfixed, as if an unseen force held us there, unable to look away. The voice was filled with an ancient sorrow, causing a heavy sadness to settle over us. Just as I thought I would be lost in this melody forever, one friend managed to break free from the trance. He grabbed me, whispering, "Run." We snapped out of our daze, realizing we needed to escape. Turning, we bolted back the way we came. The song grew fainter behind us, but the chill lingered, clawing at our hearts. After running a short distance, we heard the song again, this time more urgent and angry, as if reproaching us for leaving. Unable to resist, I glanced back, catching a glimpse of the shadowy figure in the clearing. It writhed in the mist, seemingly furious, watching our every move. As we picked up speed, the mist began to thin, and the song faded into the depths of the forest until it was gone. We finally reached our campsite, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath as we looked around in shock. Everyone's face was etched with fear and confusion. We had experienced something beyond explanation. Though the song had ceased, a lingering chill remained, as if that presence was still watching us from somewhere unseen. We stayed awake by the campfire all night, watching the flames flicker, haunted by the presence that had almost entrapped us. The oppressive feeling never lifted, and it felt as though the shadow still lurked in the surrounding darkness. Dawn finally broke, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, dispelling the night's chill. We quickly packed up, eager to leave the forest. No one spoke about the night, as if we had all silently agreed it was a nightmare best forgotten. As we neared the edge of the forest, the tension seemed to lift, and everyone let out a sigh of relief. But just as we were about to leave, a long, faint whisper echoed in our ears, as if calling out from deep within the forest. We froze, glancing back. The forest was calm and bathed in morning light, but we knew last night's experience wasn't a figment of our imagination. That low, mournful song, that faceless shadow, would be etched in our memories forever. Since that night, none of us ever returned to that forest. When we occasionally talk about the camping trip, we all avoid mentioning that night, as though the memory is too heavy to confront. Yet, sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I can almost hear that haunting song, drifting through my ears as if to remind me it still waits in that deep, dark forest, waiting for the next unsuspecting wanderer. That weekend night, we decided to camp in a secluded mountain valley. The valley was surrounded by dense forests and rolling mountains, far from the noise of the city. As night fell, the temperature in the mountains dropped sharply, and the air carried a hint of moisture. We set up our tents and built a campfire. The firelight flickered in the tranquil darkness, adding a bit of warmth to the shadowy woods. As the night deepened, darkness gradually swallowed our surroundings, leaving only the faint glow of the fire beside us. Just as we sat around the fire chatting, we suddenly heard strange footsteps echoing from the woods. The steps were slow and steady, as if an uninvited guest were wandering through the trees. We looked around, but saw only the indistinct outlines of trees in the darkness, with no sign of anyone. A chill rose from the depths of my heart. My friends exchanged glances, puzzled expressions on their faces. Someone whispered, "Maybe it's a wild animal?" Yet the footsteps didn't fade over time. Instead, they seemed to draw closer, circling around us, faintly audible from all directions. The footsteps circled around us, sometimes near, sometimes distant, as though an invisible presence was deliberately walking around us. At first, we tried to convince ourselves that it was just the wind rustling through the leaves, or perhaps a small animal moving through the woods. However, the steady rhythm and persistence of the footsteps made us increasingly uneasy, as it didn't sound like any ordinary wild animal. Holding my flashlight tightly, I pointed it toward the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the night, illuminating a few isolated trees, but revealed no trace of any creature. Yet the footsteps continued, as if purposefully staying just outside the reach of the light. A chill crawled up my spine, and I turned to look behind me, only to see the same darkness and swaying shadows of trees. "Let's head back to the tents," one friend whispered, his voice tinged with unease. Everyone nodded, and we hurriedly got up, each heading toward our tents, hoping to find some sense of security within the thin walls of fabric. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, forcing myself to ignore the sounds outside. Yet the footsteps continued to echo, seemingly growing clearer, as if they were now pacing right outside my tent. I held my breath, listening closely. The footsteps came and went throughout the camp, drawing closer, then moving away, as if something was carefully observing our movements. I wanted to call out to my friends, but the fear trapped my voice in my throat, leaving me unable to make a sound. In that moment, I could only listen helplessly, my heartbeat racing, cold sweat gathering in my palms. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. The heavy steps paused, as if hesitating whether to come closer. I held my breath, motionless, my body frozen as if numb. A moment later, a faint rustling sound came from outside the tent, as if something was gently stroking the fabric. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my heart felt as though it might burst from my chest. The sound of rubbing continued for a while, then faded away. Silence returned to the surroundings. I let out a slow breath, thinking that perhaps the thing had finally left. Yet just as I relaxed, the footsteps suddenly started up again, this time right outside another friend's tent, with the same slow, heavy steps. I could sense that my friends were also tensely holding their breaths, each of us too terrified to make a sound. Time dragged on painfully as the footsteps moved back and forth around the campsite, as if deliberately tormenting us. The night grew deeper, the darkness outside the tent impenetrable, while only the footsteps reverberated continuously. Suddenly, I heard one friend whisper, "Who's out there?" I held my breath, listening, but the footsteps didn't stop. Instead, they seemed to come closer. My friend asked again, "Who's outside?" His voice trembled, revealing that he felt as terrified as I did. Outside the tent, there was still no response, only the steady, unhurried footsteps, as though savoring our fear. At last, the footsteps began to move away, fading into the darkness. The campsite fell silent once more. Just when we thought the danger had passed, a low humming suddenly drifted in from afar, the sound eerie and ethereal, as though some hidden presence in the darkness was singing an ancient melody. My heartbeat quickened again, feeling that the humming carried an irresistible allure, as if it were summoning us to approach. I didn't dare move, curling up in my sleeping bag, trying to feel safer. The humming floated on the night breeze, drawing nearer, then retreating, with a haunting rhythm beyond description. Suddenly, I felt a gust of cold air seep through the gap in my tent, and the air around me grew colder, as if an invisible presence were lingering outside. I shut my eyes, praying for it all to end soon. But the humming continued in my ears, carrying an allure that was impossible to ignore. In the darkness, I seemed to hear faint gasping sounds from my friends' tents, indicating that they were experiencing the same fear. Then, the humming abruptly ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. The quiet was so absolute that I sensed something was wrong. I opened my eyes, listening intently, trying to detect any sound. But aside from the pounding of my own heartbeat, there was nothing. In that moment, I began to wonder if it had all been a hallucination. Yet the fear I'd felt was real, etched into my bones. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound came from outside my tent. I held my breath, my heart nearly stopping. The tapping was intermittent, as if testing for my reaction. I closed my eyes, too terrified to confront whatever was outside, and could only wait helplessly for it to end. Eventually, the tapping faded away, and silence settled around me once more. I opened my eyes, feeling utterly drained by the fear. Outside, the sky was gradually brightening, and the first light of dawn crept through the gap in my tent, bringing a touch of warmth, as if dispelling some of the night's cold terror. Finally, it was morning. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, and the night's chill was gradually replaced by warmth. We cautiously emerged from our tents, faces etched with exhaustion and fear. No one spoke, silently packing up, eager to leave this forest. As we prepared to set off, someone glanced back at last night's campsite. Near the spot where we had sat around the campfire, there seemed to be a faint trail of small footprints, stretching out in the direction we were leaving, disappearing into the depths of the forest. Each of our faces paled, as if the unknown thing was still watching us, ready to reappear at any moment. On the way back, no one mentioned the events of the previous night. We all seemed to have silently chosen to forget. However, the heavy footsteps, the eerie humming, and the tapping outside the tents were like scars in my memory, lingering long after. Back in the safety of civilization, my friends almost never brought up that night's experience again. But I knew that the terror from that night would forever remain in our memories. Every now and then, in the stillness of the night, I could almost hear those echoing footsteps, faintly drifting from afar, as if to remind us that whatever we encountered that night still lurks in that deep, mysterious forest, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitor. That night, we found a clearing deep in the forest and decided to spend the night there. Moonlight filtered through the gaps in the leaves, casting mottled shadows on the ground that appeared eerie and mysterious. The surroundings were silent, with only the occasional calls of night birds and the rustling of leaves as the wind brushed through the treetops. The night was pitch black, and the entire forest seemed to be enveloped in an invisible atmosphere that sent chills down our spines. We set up our tents and sat by the campfire to warm ourselves. The flames flickered, casting shadows of each of us on the ground, alternately light and dark, as if these shadows were quietly watching us. Just as we began to relax and enjoy the peace of the night, a low, murmuring voice drifted from somewhere in the distance. It was indistinct, as though someone were whispering softly. We all paused our conversation and exchanged glances. The sound came and went with the wind, elusive and faint, as if some presence was wandering through the darkness. The expressions on my friends' faces gradually became serious, and the previously light-hearted mood was slowly replaced by a sense of unease that we couldn't explain. The low murmuring continued to reach us with the night breeze, as though it were an ancient whisper from deep within the forest. At first, we tried to ignore it and continued talking, but the sound seemed to grow louder, as if it was intentionally making itself heard. With each gust of wind, the murmurs drew closer, faint yet filled with an irresistible pull. I gripped my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing nothing but endless darkness. My friends gradually fell silent, exchanging tense looks, as though they too sensed the growing unease. We realized that this strange sound couldn't be the wind or an animal. It felt like something hidden in the darkness was watching us. Maybe someone's camping nearby? One friend whispered, trying to lighten the mood, though his voice held a hint of unease. Another friend shook his head and replied, "Who would be whispering in the forest this late?" We all fell silent, unsure of how to respond. As the night grew deeper, the whispers grew clearer, as if circling us. Each time I tried to locate the source, the sound faded like smoke. Just as I was about to give up, I felt as though a shadow brushed past us, vanishing into the darkness. "Did any of you see that?" I asked softly, fear tightening my voice. My friends nodded uneasily, though no one could be certain of what we had seen. The moonlight bathed the forest in eerie shadows, and I felt as though countless unseen eyes were watching us. We tried to reassure each other to stay calm, but the feeling of being observed lingered. Then, abruptly, the whispers ceased, and the forest fell into a deathly silence. No wind, no birds, as though the entire world had been muted. The stillness was unnerving, like a threat slowly closing in. I gripped my flashlight tighter, sweeping it around, but found nothing. Just as we decided to retreat to the tents, the murmuring resumed, even closer this time, as if from an unseen corner. Holding my breath, I listened intently. The whisper seemed to carry fragments of some language, disjointed, hard to decipher, yet filling me with dread. Suddenly, the whispers quickened, as though urging us closer. My heart raced, a cold chill creeping over me. One friend finally broke down, his voice trembling as he said, "We should leave now." Everyone quickly agreed, clearly unwilling to stay any longer. But just as we turned to leave, I heard light footsteps behind us, as though someone was approaching stealthily. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but there was nothing there. The footsteps had vanished as though they'd never existed. We stood frozen, not daring to move, afraid of disturbing something unseen. The silence around us felt suffocating, only our breaths sounded in the quiet night. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind swept by, carrying the murmurs around us. There was a tone of sorrow in the sound, like a lament whispered just for us. I couldn't make out the words, but a profound fear gripped me, as though I were trapped in an unknown world with no escape. As we stood there helplessly, one friend suddenly pointed into the distance, his voice shaking as he asked, "What's that?" We looked where he was pointing and saw a faint figure standing among the shadows of the trees. The silhouette remained still, its indistinct outline eerily highlighted by the moonlight. I blinked, unable to believe my eyes. The shadow remained, watching us intently. Then, it began to drift toward us, its movement soundless, as if floating above the ground. My heart nearly stopped, a coldness spreading through me. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the figure drew nearer. Just as it came within a few feet, the whispers surrounded us, echoing from all directions, trapping us in place. The shadow halted within the whispers, watching us silently. My mind went blank, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. Just as I thought I would be trapped in terror forever, the shadow turned away, vanishing into the depths of the forest. The whispers faded, swallowed by the dark woods. We remained frozen, no one daring to speak, our hearts pounding in our chests. The eerie voices and the mysterious figure were etched into our minds, like a nightmare we couldn't wake from. A light breeze swept over us, bringing a chill that made me realize I was drenched in cold sweat, as if I'd narrowly escaped death itself. With dawn's first light filtering through the trees, warmth finally returned to the campsite. We hadn't slept a wink, and as we crawled from our tents, we exchanged glances without saying a word. Quietly, we packed our things, eager to leave the forest. As we prepared to head back, one friend's face turned pale as he pointed to the spot around the campfire where we'd sat last night. Following his gaze, we noticed faint footprints trailing from our seats into the depths of the forest, as if the shadow had indeed been watching us, slipping away silently while we were unaware. A chill ran through each of us, and we quickened our pace, desperate to leave. On the way back, no one mentioned the events of the previous night, as though we'd reached a silent agreement to lock away that memory. Back in the safety of the city, my friends rarely brought up that camping trip. Yet, in the stillness of the night, I sometimes hear those faint whispers in my mind, drifting from the depths of that distant forest, a haunting reminder that the mysterious figure from that night still waits for the next unsuspecting visitor to enter its domain. For this camping trip, we chose a remote edge of the forest. Local residents had told us that few people ventured into that forest, and it was even rumored to be a forbidden land. Intrigued by the legend, my friends and I felt that this only added a sense of adventure and excitement. When we finally arrived, dusk was already settling in. The forest was unusually quiet, no bird calls, only the sound of our feet crunching on dead leaves echoing around us. The air was thick with a damp, slightly decayed scent. We set up our tents and started a campfire, hoping the flames would chase away the surrounding shadows. As night fell, everything grew even quieter, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. The firelight cast eerie shadows on the trees, making them look twisted and menacing. That's when one of us noticed that the air around us was gradually growing colder, a chill that carried an unsettling feeling, as if something unknown in the darkness was watching us. The night deepened, and although the campfire was warm, it couldn't seem to drive away the chill surrounding us. We sat silently by the fire, trying to relax by chatting. Yet, at some point, the air became heavier, as if something unseen lurked in the darkness of the forest. Our conversation gradually faded, and each of us grew tense, sensing an inexplicable pressure. Suddenly, a faint rustling sound came from deep within the forest. It was soft yet clear, as though something was moving slowly through the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" one friend asked softly, his voice laced with unease. We all nodded, holding our breath as we tried to figure out the direction of the sound. Yet the sound echoed around us, making it impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from every direction at once. I gripped my flashlight tightly, aiming it toward the noise, but the beam of light only revealed layers upon layers of trees, with no sign of any creature. The rustling continued, sometimes near, sometimes distant, as though something was deliberately circling us. The chill in the air intensified, like a cold presence creeping ever closer. My palms grew sweaty, and my heart pounded faster. Just then, one friend pointed to the distance and whispered, "There's a shadow." Following his gaze, we saw a faint human-like silhouette among the trees, standing motionless as if watching us. The darkness and distance made it impossible to see its features or form clearly, but we could feel the pressure it exuded. "Maybe it's just a shadow." I tried to reassure myself, but my voice betrayed my unease. We exchanged nervous glances, none of us daring to approach and find out what it was. The night was thick, the firelight flickering weakly in the dark, as if ready to be swallowed by the darkness. Then, unexpectedly, the shadow took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate, exuding a strange sense of pressure. We all held our breath, our hearts nearly stopping, as we watched it draw closer, step by step. "Maybe we should leave," one friend said, his voice trembling with fear. The rest of us nodded, clearly no one wanted to stay in this eerie place. Just as we began to extinguish the fire and pack up, the shadow stopped and disappeared into the darkness. We let out a collective sigh of relief, thinking maybe it had just been our imagination. But a second later, the rustling started again, this time so close it was within reach. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, only to find a series of clear footprints appearing in the soil, slowly making their way toward us. The footprints seemed to form out of thin air, each one sinking deeply into the soil, inching closer to us. A shiver ran down my spine, cold sweat trickling down my forehead, and I found myself instinctively stepping back. "What is that?" one friend whispered in alarm, his voice full of fear. We stood rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do. The footprints continued approaching, as though some invisible presence was drawing near, though we could see no figure. Just a few meters away from us, the footprints abruptly stopped, and silence returned to the camp. This quiet did nothing to ease our tension. If anything, it made us more anxious. The air was heavy, stifling, as if we were being smothered. Trying to suppress my fear, I forced a nervous smile and said, "Maybe we're just on edge. It could be a natural phenomenon." Despite my words, the uncertainty in my voice was clear. At that moment, a low murmur sounded around us, faint and fragmented, like someone whispering softly. We looked around, but there was no one. The voice carried a strange, ancient rhythm, filling us with an indescribable fear. The murmur grew clearer, surrounding us from all directions. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand on end as fear washed over me in waves. The voice seemed to be calling us, carrying an allure that was impossible to resist. As I felt myself nearly consumed by the sound, a friend grabbed my arm, pulling me back to reality. He whispered urgently, "Let's go. We can't stay here." The others quickly agreed, scrambling to pack up, eager to leave this unsettling camp. But as we hurried to gather our things, I glanced back and saw those footprints reappear on the ground, once again drawing closer. It seemed that whatever was out there wasn't about to let us leave so easily. It was waiting, silently watching for us to make the first move. We finished packing and rushed toward the edge of the campsite, hearts racing. Just before we exited the forest, I couldn't resist looking back. The footprints were still there, trailing us, as though some invisible force was chasing us through the darkness. Once we were out of the forest, no one spoke. We piled into the car, started the engine, and sped away from that eerie place. On the drive back, we were silent, each of us seeming to try and erase the recent events from our minds. Yet, the low murmur and the footprints inching closer lingered, echoing in my mind. Back in the safety of civilization, none of us spoke of that night. But whenever the night is quiet and I close my eyes, I find myself back in that cold, dark forest, hearing that whisper faintly in my ears, as though it's coming from far away, or perhaps right beside me. Whatever secrets that forbidden land hides may remain unknown forever, but one thing I know for sure, I'll never set foot there again. That night, we decided to camp in a forest near a lake. As dusk fell, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, calm and mysterious. Towering trees surrounded us, their shadows cast deep reflections on the water, like a bottomless abyss. We set up our tents and gathered around the campfire. The fire crackled softly, illuminating our small patch of space. Nights by the lake seemed colder than elsewhere, the breeze from the water brought a chilling coldness. For some reason, the lake's tranquility had an oppressive feel, as if something unspeakable was hidden beneath its depths. We listened closely, and faint calls floated from the distance, carried by the wind only to vanish over the lake's surface. The sound was low and distant, carrying an inexplicable sorrow, as if rising from the lake's depths, cutting through the calm waters to cast a shadow over each of our hearts. "You heard that too, right?" one friend whispered, his voice tinged with unease. We all nodded, exchanging glances, uncertain about the source of the sound. As we speculated, the voice echoed again, this time clearer, as though it was rising slowly from beneath the water, like something calling faintly from the depths. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the lake lapping against the shore, but the subtle murmur and rhythm defied any natural explanation. My friends also fell silent, a tense look in their eyes. "Maybe it's just our imagination?" one friend offered quietly. We decided to distract ourselves, attempting to continue light-hearted conversations. Yet the sound continued to haunt us. It came and went without pattern, sometimes close, sometimes distant, like an unseen presence that drew near, only to retreat. As time passed, the air grew colder, as if the temperature around us was steadily dropping. Just as we were growing accustomed to its presence, ripples suddenly appeared on the lake's surface, the water stirring under the moonlight and breaking the serene calm. Our gazes turned to the center of the lake, hearts racing as if bracing for something terrible. Under the moonlight, the lake shimmered, its ripples spreading in widening circles, as if something were about to emerge. The faint call grew clearer, echoing close to our ears with an irresistibly magnetic pull. My heart began to race, my mind filling with eerie visions. "There's something there," one friend cried, pointing to the center of the lake. We followed his gaze and saw a faint shadow forming on the water, resembling a human shape. It floated, drifting closer to us, as if with a purpose. This can't be," I muttered, a wave of fear welling up within me. The figure grew clearer, vaguely human but lacking a face, only a blurred outline in the moonlight, strangely haunting. As we stared in silence, the figure halted, drifting just a short distance from us. The air grew colder still, as though a chill from the lake was slowly encircling us. I heard one of my friends breathing heavily, clearly terrified by the sight before us. "Maybe it's just a reflection," another friend whispered, trying to reassure himself, though his voice was laced with fear. The figure remained motionless, as though waiting for something. The low call sounded again, nearer this time, as if it came from right beside us. Every hair on my body stood on end, and I instinctively stepped back. The call carried a sorrowful magnetism, drawing us closer to the lake, almost inviting us to wade into its bottomless depths. My foot moved involuntarily, but sheer terror stopped me. Just then, the figure began to sink, vanishing beneath the water's surface, leaving the lake calm once more, as if nothing had happened. Yet we all knew what we'd witnessed was no illusion. I felt cold sweat on my back, my hands trembling with fear. We should leave," a friend finally broke the silence, his voice quivering with fright. We all nodded, clearly unwilling to stay a moment longer. As we hastily gathered our things, the call sounded once more, louder this time, carrying a force that seemed to reproach us for trying to leave. I fought against my growing terror, urging everyone to hurry. Just as we were about to leave, The reeds by the lake began to sway, as though pulled by an unseen force. We instinctively took a few steps back, hearts pounding as we felt something watching us intently. The call grew louder, filled with endless sorrow and weight. It seemed to be telling us something, carrying a suffocating melancholy. My strength faded, and I stood frozen, that ethereal, mournful sound echoing in my ears. Just when I thought I'd be trapped forever, one friend yanked my arm, breaking the spell. "Run! Don't look back," he whispered urgently. We sprinted toward the forest, not daring to turn around, fearing that thing might suddenly reappear. After running a while, I risked a glance back, noticing slight ripples still disturbing the lake's surface, as if the shadow still waited below. The call faded on the wind, but I knew it would forever echo in my mind. As we talked by the fire, a low call suddenly rose in the distance, seeming to come from the lake's depths. The sound was faint and drawn out, carrying a hidden longing, as if calling for something. We paused, glancing at each other, unsure if we had truly heard it. We sprinted from the forest, stopping only when the lake was far behind us. Each of us panted for breath, fear etched onto our faces. We silently gathered our belongings, not daring to look back toward the lake. In the car, no one spoke, the silence almost as heavy as the fear we'd felt. Back in the city, we rarely spoke of that night, as though it had been nothing more than a bizarre nightmare. Yet, in the stillness of the night, I can always hear that low call, like it's rising from the lake's distant depths, carrying a hint of sorrow and invitation, constantly reminding me of the secrets hidden beneath those waters. Each time I close my eyes, I find myself back by the lake, hearing that ethereal call, as if it's waiting for me to return. Since that night, I've never returned to the forest by the lake, yet the memory of that night haunts me like a nightmare, engraved deeply in my mind. Perhaps that lake will forever await its next unsuspecting visitor, and that low call will continue to linger in the quiet of the night. That night, the sky was overcast, and we decided to venture deep into the forest to camp. As night fell, a dense fog quietly descended over the entire forest, reducing visibility and casting shadows that loomed and shifted, as though monstrous creatures waited in the mist. After walking for a long time, we stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin in the fog. The cabin was hidden among the trees, almost blending into the mist, and it looked like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was weathered and splintered, the windows broken, and weeds grew wild around the door. We had planned to keep moving, but as night settled further, the cabin became our only refuge from the cold and the mist. For some reason, standing in front of that cabin gave me a sense of inexplicable dread. My friends urged me not to overthink it, so we pushed open the creaking wooden door, ready to shelter ourselves from the eerie mist and biting cold. Inside, the air was filled with a stale, moldy smell, as if no one had set foot here for decades. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath our feet, seeming ready to collapse at any moment. Dust and cobwebs covered every corner, and faint light trickled through the broken windows, casting a dim glow. The cabin was eerily silent, with only the sound of our cautious footsteps echoing in the still air. The interior was sparsely furnished, with a few rickety chairs and a fragile-looking table, and faded paintings on the walls, their subjects too indistinct to make out. Through the window, the mist outside grew thicker, almost as if it intended to swallow the entire forest whole. "Maybe we can rest here for a bit until the fog clears," one friend suggested, and everyone nodded in agreement, clearly reluctant to move on in this weather. We each found a spot to sit, trying to relax, but an unshakable sense of unease lingered in the air. Just as we were settling in, we heard a faint tapping sound outside, as if something was pacing around the cabin door. We exchanged worried glances, our hearts pounding, none of us daring to speak first. The tapping came and went, sometimes distant, sometimes close, like a strange rhythmic signal. "Maybe it's just branches blown by the wind," one friend whispered, though uncertainty wavered in his voice. We held our breath, straining to identify the source of the sound, but just as we thought it had stopped, a strange murmur filled the cabin. The voice was low and muffled, as if coming from all around, with an unintelligible tone, almost like an ancient language. We looked around but saw nothing, only the disembodied whispers lingering in the air, sometimes near, sometimes distant. "Who's there?" I shouted, summoning all my courage, but only our echoes and the ever-growing whispers replied. My friends were frozen in place, their faces pale, clearly as frightened as I was by the scene unfolding around us. At that moment, a faint scraping sound came from one corner of the room, as if something was creeping closer. We held our breath, our gaze fixed on that dark corner where, in the dim light, a shadow began to take form. It was small and indistinct, resembling a child sitting on the floor, but it had no face, just an empty outline radiating an eerie aura. We were too petrified to move, staring as the shadow inched closer. The air grew thick with an oppressive pressure, a chilling sense that seeped into our bones. The figure stopped just a few steps away, standing still as though waiting for something. My heart raced, my palms slick with cold sweat, and countless terrifying thoughts flashed through my mind. Finally, one friend whispered, "We need to get out of here. This place is too creepy." Everyone nodded, no one willing to stay in that sinister cabin any longer. Just as we started to rise, rapid footsteps suddenly echoed from outside the door, as if something was pacing frantically, trying to get into the cabin. The footsteps grew louder and closer, like a relentless chase. We froze, not daring to make a sound, fearful of drawing attention from whatever lurked outside. Then, the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of our heavy breathing. We exchanged panicked glances, no one daring to check the door. But the next moment, the door handle began to turn slowly, making a sharp, grating noise, as though some unseen force was trying to push it open. My hand trembled, clutching a friend's arm tightly, terrified that the door would burst open any second. At the last possible moment, the sounds outside ceased, and an eerie silence fell over the cabin once again. We breathed a sigh of relief, but the fear lingered. As we prepared to make a break for it, the murmur inside the cabin resumed, this time tinged with a faint laugh, as though mocking our terror. The laugh was chilling, carrying a sinister energy that made our skin crawl. Without hesitating, we scrambled to the door. As we flung it open, the mist outside thickened even further, and darkness engulfed everything around us. In the distance, we heard an indistinct sound, as if the entire forest was laughing at us. We ran desperately, the mist swirling around us, reluctant to let us escape from its grasp. After what felt like an eternity, we finally left the cabin far behind, but the faint, deep laughter continued to echo in our ears, as if we would never be free of that terrifying place. I glanced back once, only to see the cabin barely visible in the mist, like a gaping mouth waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting guest. We sprinted out of the forest, not stopping until the cabin was completely out of sight. We gasped for breath, our faces etched with terror and exhaustion. Though we'd left it behind, the laughter still rang in our ears, with a never-ending chill and mockery. In silence, we packed up and hurried away from the area. No one spoke on the way back, everyone's face was ghostly pale, as though trying to erase the memory of what had just happened. Yet, in the days that followed, I couldn't shake that night from my mind, the cabin, the laughter, the shadows. In the dead of night, when all is quiet, I can still faintly hear that laugh echoing in my mind, as if calling me back. Since then, none of us have dared return to that forest, but the memory of that night haunts me like a nightmare, forever etched in my mind. Perhaps that cabin will always wait for the next unwary visitor, and the faint, mocking laughter will continue to echo in that deep, dark forest, never fading away. That night, we chose to camp at the edge of a nearly untouched forest, surrounded only by endless trees standing silently under the moonlight. The night sky was dark and deep, with a few stars sparsely scattered across it, their faint glow evoking a sense of isolation. The night wind drifted by, bringing a chill that seemed to seep into our bones. We sat around the campfire, its flickering flames barely keeping the cold at bay. But at some point, the surroundings fell unnaturally silent, even the insects stopped their chirping. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something, anticipating the arrival of an unwelcome guest. In that eerie silence, I suddenly felt as though we were being watched. It was a sense of eyes upon us from the darkness, studying our every move. Although we couldn't see anything around us, the oppressive feeling grew stronger, as though some hidden presence was lurking in the shadows, silently waiting. The firelight wavered, casting dancing shadows across our tense faces. The silence around us felt thick and heavy, as if even the wind had paused. Only the occasional crackle from the fire broke the stillness, echoing into the night. A growing unease took root in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was out there, watching us from afar. "Do any of you feel something strange?" a friend whispered, their voice betraying their nerves. Everyone nodded in agreement. It was clear I wasn't the only one feeling it. Just then, a faint rustling sound came from the nearby trees, as if something were moving through the shadows. We all held our breath, eyes fixed on the direction of the sound. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating vague tree shadows, but revealing no creature. Yet the rustling persisted, drawing nearer, then drifting away, as if it were circling us. My heartbeat quickened as I gripped my flashlight, trying to contain my fear. The rustling suddenly stopped, leaving the air heavy with an unnatural silence. But instead of relief, the silence only intensified our anxiety, as though something terrible were about to happen. No one dared break the fragile equilibrium. We all sat frozen around the fire. In the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow flit by. I turned quickly, but only saw the shifting shapes of trees in the darkness.
I thought I saw something move over there, I muttered, my voice trembling.
My friends looked at me, their expressions mirroring my fear. We searched the darkness, trying to catch another glimpse of the thing, but the shadows seemed like a bottomless vortex, swallowing our gaze. At that moment, a low murmur floated from somewhere nearby. The sound was faint and disjointed, as though it were in some ancient language. I held my breath, straining to locate the source, but it seemed to come from all directions at once, impossible to pinpoint. The murmur drew closer, carrying an eerie rhythm, as if summoning something, sending chills down my spine. Maybe we should leave? One friend finally suggested, their voice laced with fear. We all nodded quickly, no one wanted to stay any longer. We began packing in a rush, ready to flee this unsettling place. But just as we were about to extinguish the fire, the murmur ceased abruptly, and silence fell over us once more. This sudden quiet was somehow even more frightening, as though something unseen were stealthily approaching. My hand tightened on the flashlight, my heartbeat pounding. In that moment, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the nearby underbrush, like some creature observing us from the darkness. The eyes were cold and emotionless, fixed on us with an unblinking gaze. We froze, not daring to move a muscle. Those eyes stayed locked on us, waiting for some reaction. A trickle of sweat rolled down my forehead as fear overwhelmed me. Just as I thought the eyes might disappear, they drew nearer, revealing a blurry outline, a figure resembling a human, yet somehow not quite. The shadow stood at a short distance, its outline vague, but its presence unmistakable. A strange pressure filled the air, as though it held an unexplainable power. My friends were as paralyzed as I was, fear evident in their eyes. Then, without warning, the figure opened its mouth and emitted a low, raspy laugh. The sound was harsh and chilling, laced with a suffocating force, as if mocking our terror. My body trembled uncontrollably, my only thought to escape from this nightmare. "Run!" I shouted, and bolted toward the edge of the forest. My friends followed, sprinting after me, while that eerie laughter trailed behind us, seemingly in pursuit. I could feel those icy eyes watching our retreating backs, as if unwilling to let us go. We ran for what felt like hours, finally stopping when exhaustion forced us to. Around us, shadows of trees loomed in the darkness, like silent sentinels. I gasped for breath, my heart still racing, and glanced back to see that the eyes had vanished. Yet the sensation of being watched lingered, clinging to me. My friends were silent, terror etched on their faces. Though we had left that dreadful place behind, we all carried the weight of the experience in our hearts. The memory of that night felt like a nightmare, one that would forever haunt us. We kept walking along the dim path out of the forest, only our footsteps echoing through the trees. Soon, familiar landmarks appeared, and we knew we were nearing the camp's exit. We exhaled in relief, thinking we'd finally escape that eerie place, but I couldn't resist one last glance back. In the depths of the forest darkness, I saw those icy eyes again, watching us from afar, as if waiting for our return. My stomach dropped, and I quickly looked away, urging everyone to pick up the pace and leave the place behind for good. Back in the city, we never spoke of that night, as if by silent agreement. But in the quiet hours of the night, when I closed my eyes, I could still feel those eyes in the darkness, their cold and oppressive gaze impossible to ignore. The memory of that night clung to me, as if the eyes had become a part of my nightmares, forever lingering in my mind, waiting silently for another encounter. Since that night, we've never dared set foot in that forest again, fearing a second encounter with that silent watcher. Yet I know, wherever I go, those eyes are out there, observing from a distance, waiting for the day we venture once more into its domain. That night, we chose a clearing deep within the forest as our campsite. As night fell, everything in the forest gradually sank into darkness, with only the faint light of our campfire flickering amidst the shadows. The sky was pitch black, with no stars or moon, and the boundless darkness seemed to engulf us, stirring a sense of unease. The night grew deeper, and the temperature dropped rapidly. A damp chill filled the air, adding to the ominous atmosphere. While we huddled around the fire for warmth, a low, haunting call sounded faintly from the distance, like an echo from the depths of the forest. The voice was deep and carried a strange rhythm, as if summoning something unknown. We looked around, but all we could see were the indistinct shadows of trees under the night sky. The sound drifted in and out, as if the forest itself was whispering secrets. My sense of unease intensified, as though an irresistible force was creeping closer. The flames danced gently, casting a warm glow over our faces. But in the dark, silent forest, that warmth felt fragile and fleeting. The night wind rustled the treetops, as if answering the distant, low call. "Did anyone else hear that?" One of my friends asked softly, his eyes filled with both confusion and a trace of fear. We exchanged uneasy glances, unable to tell if the sound was real or just our imaginations. Before we could dismiss it, the call echoed again, deep and drawn out, carrying a strange melody that felt ancient. Maybe it's just the wind, I said, trying to reassure myself. Yet, the fear within me continued to spread. I gripped my flashlight tightly, the beam barely piercing the darkness, illuminating nothing. The trees seemed to twist in the dim light, as though countless eyes were watching us from the shadows. We fell into silence, each of us too tense to speak. The sound grew closer, circling our camp, as if something unseen was lurking nearby. My heartbeat quickened, and my palms grew clammy. My friends looked equally tense, clearly sensing the same unexplainable pressure. Suddenly, soft footsteps sounded nearby. They were light and slow, as though something was quietly approaching. We held our breath, scanning the area with our flashlights, but no matter where we looked, we saw nothing. Could it be some wild animal? A friend asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. But the footsteps didn't sound like those of any animal. They were oddly measured, as if an invisible figure was slowly closing in. Just as we reached the peak of our tension, the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. The stillness was suffocating, as if an unexplainable presence lurked just beyond our sight. A chill crawled up my spine, and I instinctively inched closer to my friends. Maybe we shouldn't stay here, another friend murmured, his voice shaking. We all nodded, no one wanting to linger any longer in such an unsettling atmosphere. Just as we started gathering our things, that haunting call sounded once more, this time so close it felt like it was right beside us. My heart nearly stopped, my limbs turning stiff and unresponsive. The call seemed to carry an inescapable pull, drawing us deeper into the forest. I struggled to resist the growing fear, but the sound kept echoing in my mind, urging us to leave the safety of the fire and venture into the darkness. Don't go near it. One of my friends whispered urgently, clutching my arm, his eyes filled with terror. But the invisible pull grew stronger, as if something were manipulating our will, luring us toward the sound. Then, in the distance, a shadowy figure emerged from between the trees. It had a vaguely human shape, but its form was distorted, like an entity struggling to mimic a human appearance. It stood motionless among the trees, faceless, with only an empty silhouette, silently watching us. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move. The figure remained in the darkness, as if waiting for us to react. A strange pressure filled the air, pinning us in place, as though some unseen force had us firmly in its grasp. Let's just leave this place, another friend whispered, his voice barely audible through his fear. We nodded in agreement and hurriedly packed up, ready to flee. But as we turned to leave, the shadow moved, silently drifting closer. I felt the chill of its presence closing in, the icy sensation almost tangible. I held my breath, fighting the urge to scream, watching as it drew nearer. Just as it was about to touch me, it stopped, seemingly observing us, exuding a suffocating intensity. For a brief moment, my heart seemed to stop, a numbing cold spreading from my spine to my limbs. My friends stared at the figure in stunned silence, none of us daring to make a sound, fearing it would break the tense stillness. We braced ourselves for the worst, but the figure suddenly began to retreat, dissolving back into the darkness as if it had never existed. Yet, the oppressive feeling lingered, as if it had left behind a haunting reminder of its presence. We didn't hesitate any longer. With our backpacks hastily slung over our shoulders, we headed toward the exit, desperate to escape. The forest remained silent, save for the echo of our footsteps. My heart pounded, my mind replaying the image of the shadow, as if it was still following us, silently watching every step we took. Just before we left the forest, I couldn't resist looking back. There, faintly outlined in the shadows, was that same figure, standing where we had been moments before, watching us, as if it were waiting for us to return. I shuddered, quickly turning away, and urged everyone to keep moving, determined never to set foot in that place again. We continued along the dark path, our footsteps echoing in the silent forest. Slowly, familiar landmarks began to appear, reassuring us that we were nearing the exit. Just as we felt the relief of finally escaping, I glanced back one last time. In the depths of the forest shadows, I saw the faint outline of that figure again. It stood in the darkness, watching us, as if patiently awaiting our return. A chill ran through me, and I quickly turned away, urging everyone to leave the forest as fast as possible. Back in the city, we agreed in silence never to discuss that night, as though it had been nothing more than a surreal dream. But in the quiet of the night, I sometimes still hear that distant, low call, as if it had never left, echoing from some hidden corner of the darkness, waiting for us to venture back into its domain. Since then, we've never returned to that forest. Yet I know, wherever I go, that unknown presence is still out there, silently watching, waiting for the day we step into its territory once more. That night, a thick fog shrouded the entire forest, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The shadows of trees were blurred within the mist, as though hidden figures lurked in the darkness. We chose a small clearing to set up camp, with the faint glow of our campfire flickering in the mist, making it feel insignificant against the vast expanse of night. The damp chill in the air clung to us, as though the entire forest was silently observing our every move. As the night deepened, the surroundings became unnaturally quiet, as if every sound was swallowed by the fog. While we sat huddled around the campfire, we began to hear a faint, slow footfall from somewhere distant, a heavy and deliberate tread, sometimes approaching and sometimes retreating. It seemed to echo from within the heart of the mist, as if some unknown presence was watching us from the shadows. We exchanged glances, our heartbeats quickening. No one dared to speak, fearing that any sound might provoke whatever lay hidden in the fog. The firelight gradually dimmed, casting long shadows, while the strange footsteps continued to echo around us, filling the silence with an eerie tension. Nightfall grew deeper, and we instinctively huddled closer, as if the small warmth from the fire could ward off the oppressive atmosphere around us. But those slow, heavy footsteps persisted, moving at an unsettlingly deliberate pace, each step seeming to draw nearer. Could it be an animal? Whispered one of my friends, though his voice betrayed his own fear. We all knew the forest housed wildlife, but the sound didn't fit. It wasn't the movements of an animal, it felt like something unseen was drawing nearer, step by step. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, pointing it toward the direction of the sound, but all I could see was the dense fog and shifting tree shadows. The footsteps seemed to tease us, moving closer only to drift away, playing a game of hide and seek that kept us on edge. My heart raced, and cold sweat dampened my hands. Then, out of the mist, a shadow appeared. It stood at a distance, vaguely human in shape, yet its outline was faint and blurred. I instinctively drew a sharp breath, glancing at my friends to see their frightened faces staring in the same direction. Who's there? One of my friends called out in a trembling voice, which felt unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. The shadow, however, remained still, watching us from the fog, bringing an increasing chill to the air, as if it carried a palpable sense of dread. After a while, it slowly began to move toward us, its steps measured and unhurried, as though testing our reactions. We held our breaths, watching it approach, each step heightening our fear. No one dared to make a sound, terrified of disturbing it. When it stopped close to us, it bowed its head slightly and let out a faint whisper, a low murmur that sounded like an ancient language we couldn't comprehend. My friends stood frozen, faces pale with fear. I tried to make out its face, but its features were shrouded in darkness, there was nothing but an empty void. Then, just as suddenly, the whispering ceased, and the shadow turned as if to leave. We let out a collective sigh of relief, but then it abruptly stopped, turning to face us once more with an icy gaze, as though it were issuing a silent warning. A chill settled over us, stealing our breath and locking us in place with fear. The shadow began to murmur again, but this time, its voice held an undeniable pull, almost beckoning us to come closer. My feet nearly moved of their own accord, but the rising terror within me forced me to stop. I resisted, feeling an inexplicable urge to follow it, yet struggling against the inexplicable lure of its voice. "Don't go over there." One of my friends whispered urgently, gripping my arm, his tone laced with fear. I nodded, focusing on resisting the strange compulsion, though the shadow's whisper lingered in my ears, tugging at me with its haunting allure. We pressed closer to each other, no one daring to make a move. The shadow retreated back into the fog, slowly vanishing from our sight, yet the oppressive atmosphere clung to us like a thick haze, leaving a deep unease in its wake. Just as we thought the tension had lifted, another set of footsteps echoed from the distance. This time, they moved even slower, as though purposefully stretching out each step. We held our breath again, our eyes darting around as we braced ourselves for its return. But the footsteps never approached, instead fading away as if they were drifting further into the night. The silence returned, but fear still gripped our hearts. We knew that the shadow had not truly left. It lingered somewhere in the forest, waiting for us to let our guard down. The fog thickened, nearly obscuring everything around us. I could no longer bear the oppressive atmosphere and suggested we leave. My friends quickly agreed, no one wanted to stay a second longer. We hastily packed up, preparing to abandon this unsettling place. As we finished packing and prepared to extinguish the fire, I caught a faint whisper close to my ear. It sounded like the shadow's voice. I froze, unwilling to look back, gripping my flashlight tightly and forcing myself to keep moving forward. We fled the campsite, our footsteps echoing through the dense fog. I could feel an unseen presence following us, clinging to us as we moved through the night. Even after we'd left the forest, my friends' faces remained tense and pale, like they'd just escaped a nightmare. As we finally stopped to catch our breath, I couldn't resist a final glance behind us. In the distance, through the thinning fog, I saw a vague silhouette, standing perfectly still as it watched us. A shiver ran down my spine, and I urged everyone to hurry away without looking back. We walked quickly along the forest path, the fog lingering thick around us, but we kept moving. Familiar landmarks began to appear, signaling we were nearing the forest's edge. Just as relief washed over us, I glanced back one last time. Through the fog, the shadow lingered, silently watching us depart. Its hollow form carried an inescapable sense of dread that made me shiver. I turned back around, pushing my friends to move faster, determined never to set foot in that forest again. Back in the city, none of us spoke about that night, as if by silent agreement. Yet every time I close my eyes in the stillness of night, I hear the faint echo of footsteps, distant yet insistent. I know that the shadow in that forest hasn't vanished. It waits in the dark depths, ready for the next unsuspecting visitor to step into its domain. Since then, we've never gone back. That night lingers like a nightmare, with the shadow's gaze forever etched in my memory, as if it's still watching, always waiting.